illustrate a few things I wanted to tell you about on the airplane. First of all, I was graduated from flying school in 1943, October the 1st, in 43I class as a pilot, and I was first assigned as a basic flight instructor after I got out of flying school. And so I lost quite a bit of time there of not being able to fly fighters. But they decided to close the school down towards early in 1944 because they had plenty of pilots. And they started tapering down on the number of pilots that they were turning out. And so at that time, I was assigned to learn to fly fighters. I ended up getting into fighters about June the 15th, 1944, at Chico, California, about 75 miles north of Sacramento. So that's where I got my fighter training. And just before that, I took some gunnery that I didn't get as a cadet at Ajo, Arizona, out of Williams, there at Phoenix, and got the AT-6 gunnery out at Ajo, and then we moved to Victorville, California, which was named after sometime later. We called it Victorville Air Force Base at that time. But at that base in April of 44, I got to fly finally fighters at P-39s, fighter transition. But I only got 6 hours in the P-39. I might mention during that time I was shot down theoretically by a B-24 on my tail. One of my most embarrassing moments in my career. I was flying the 38. The 39. We had a need pad, and we had different missions. In that 6 hours, we'd go up and record RPM and engine temperature and what have you at a different altitude and speed. And I was busy doing that, and I was getting ready to turn, and I just happened to look back, and here was a B-24 on my tail, and he was cocked up at about a 60-degree bank angle, and right on my tail, about a few hundred yards back, and well, it really irritated me. So I tightened up the turn. It took me 2 complete turns, 720 degrees, to finally get on his tail. And I could just imagine a couple of those pilots, maybe cigars in their mouth and their feet on the dash, both of them pulling as hard as they could. I don't think they had power controls in those days on the bombers. And so anyway, I could imagine those guys with cigars or something just laughing like crazy on my tail, shooting down a P-39. Anyway, when I finally got on their tail, they rolled out and headed west, probably to Palmdale or Muroc, someplace. But anyway, we got up to Chico about June the 15th, roughly, and I flew P-63s. That's an enlarged version of the P-39, a little better supercharging and altitude performance, bigger wing, laminar airfoil, but a thick wing, unfortunately. And it had better performance than the 39, and it was a joy to fly. And we had 3 pilots to go in flat spins in the P-63. 2 of them went in with an airplane. One managed to get out. His name was Porter, good friend. And one of the pilots that went into the airplane owed me $5 he'd borrowed, so I lost that $5. I'm just kidding. Uh, but anyway, we switched after that to P-38s, and I think we got about 60 hours in the 63 before we just all of a sudden we had P-38s, and after those flat spins, and so I got about 30 hours in the 38 before we went overseas, and uh, I didn't get up to well, might back up a little. Went over on the Queen Elizabeth, 20,000 people on the Queen Elizabeth stacked on the walls like bookshelves and or bunks, and 20 of us in a room that's designed for 2 or 3 people. And so we went over there in late November, and I on finally on December the 15th of 1944, I left England as a passenger in a C-47 to go across the channel to Paris, and we got stymied in Paris for a couple of weeks because of the Battle of the Bulge. They're about to take our airfield in Belgium at that time, at Florence, Belgium. But finally they blunted that, and so on the 1st of January, after traveling by train from Paris to Liège, Belgium, via uh, the capital there in Belgium, Hunts. Uh, anyway, we finally made it on January the 1st to our squadron. And I might mention in Liège that night before on New Year's Eve, the the city was being bombarded by buzz bombs. Every few minutes, you'd hear this buzz bomb and the engine would cut off and then boom, and shake the buildings. And I don't remember how many, but it seemed to me like 15 or 20 at least buzz bombs was hitting the city while we were there for a couple of hours before getting on a truck to go down to our Florence, about 60 miles away. And that's where I started flying P-38s in combat. And after a delay there a while, I finally got my first mission. I flew 27 missions in the 38 before I got shot down by ground fire. We did all kinds of missions, mostly escorting medium bombers there in Belgium and Germany, and the other missions were various things, but mainly dive bombing or strafing. And I got shot down my 27th mission on April the 10th, 1945, just before sundown. We were down strafing half tracks and trucks coming out of the forest that were hidden during the day. The Germans hid during the day in the forest at that stage of the war. And they were coming out, and we were looking for just that, just before sundown, it was about 5 o'clock. It's my third mission of the day that I was shot down. So I guess you might be interested in that story, and also maybe back up and talk about the P-38 a little bit. Some of you may already know a lot about the history of the 38, its development and so forth, but I might mention a few things I think is just interesting. The plane was put out on contract by the Army Air Corps in 1937, and Lockheed won the right to build the airplane as an interceptor for long-range bombers coming in to this country. We didn't know if there was any of that had ever happened, but they wanted an airplane that could counter it if they would need it. So it was designed as a bomber interceptor, not as a fighter or anything. And the first models had a much more pointed nose than these later models, and they had the main difference was on the leading edge, the supercharger, turbo supercharger, cooled the compressed air before it went in the carburetor out in the leading edge of the wing. They pumped the air from the supercharger into the leading edge and back before it went into the carburetor. And so that was the intercooling method on the first batch of airplanes. They had trouble with those in the 8th Air Force. And at altitude, they'd overheat and detonate. The engines would knock, detonate, and lose power and different things. So they redesigned it actually before it actually went to England. They discovered that. But they had those in England, and they did give trouble. So about 1943, actually, they started developing the change from that before the English episodes, but the English episodes confirmed that they needed to make those changes they'd already started working on. They put the intercooler under the nose. This is not a radiator for the engine. This is intercooling for the supercharger air. They took, instead of doing it in the leading edge, they put it in here with the oil cooler, and no glycol for the engines. It was cooled in here. So this bathtub this big nose was designed to improve the intercooling of the engine. And in this leading edge that they'd had the intercoolers in before, they put 45-gallon tanks of fuel in each leading edge, 45, a total of 90. That's equivalent to about an hour of cruising on time at 90. So that's what happened on these. The aileron boost was put in at the same time they made this change. The lateral arrangement of this for the engines way out here, as a fighter, it was slow on roll rate because the mass moment of inertia about the roll axis is spread out so that you can't flip it like you can a single engine fighter. So they wanted to improve that, but they put the aileron boost out here on this, and it might have helped a little bit, but you still have that mass that you've got to accelerate and roll rate. And so you could flip the ailerons, but you still had to move that. So the first aileron boost, as my understanding, it was 16-1. They'd reduced the effort on the wheel. It had a wheel in a P-38 instead of a stick for the ailerons. And when they did that, it was just too sensitive. And it went down to 10-1 on the effort, and it was still, they destroyed, in my opinion, the harmony of the controls, where you have about equal effort on your rudder pedals as compared to your effort on your ailerons. And after that, you just kind of flew it with fingertips on the ailerons, but you still had to really mash on the rudder pedals. So the harmony, to me, was not as good as the old planes without the aileron boost. I flew both types in training. I flew some of the old ones without the aileron boost, and I liked them better than I did the ones with the aileron boost. The other thing they put in this on this one because of the compressibility on all this bulging, thick airfoil and everything. About 500 miles an hour at high altitude, you start getting little shock waves over the thing, and the turbulence over the tail and the downwash over the tail, they couldn't pull out until they got to lower altitudes, and that Mach number subsided because of the difference in temperature as you got lower. And then when you did that, of course, you were no longer transonic on the flow field over the wings, and but you had to get pretty low, like 10,000 feet, before you could pull out. So they didn't like that, and they put on what they call dive brakes. They were hinged. When they came down, there were just a sheet metal under here that was electrically actuated, not hydraulic, but electric. And unlike the other flaps and everything, they were hydraulic. So this electric would come down like this under the wing, and it'd slow the airplane down and give you a very strong nose up pitch. And it would overcome this transonic thing. If you wanted to pop those at a higher altitude, you got in a dive you wanted to get out of, you didn't have to wait till it get to low altitude to get out. So they made those changes on these two late models, the J and the L models. And the other thing I might mention, they wanted to get rid of torque effects, so they made the engines, both engines, turn in opposite directions, so that to kill the torque, you'd have a torque going this way and a torque that way, and it'd end up with zero torque. And so the method they used after you got into a dive, the turbos would tend to surge a little bit, like this in a dive, as you changed altitudes. So they had synchronized the power, the pressure from the turbos. It was supposed to be synchronized to keep this surge from happening. In other words, it would make little corrections automatically to kill that surge in a dive. And this model, they went from hydraulic actuated surge killers to electric. It was done electric. I don't know to this day. I may have known, but I don't know now how they actually did this, how they control that pressure difference between these going into the carburetor. So the thing had several improvements that way, but as I said, overall, it wasn't to my liking, this aileron boost. I'd rather they'd kept the old one, kept the harmony of the controls better. Anyway, let's see. There's other thing. Oh, I might mention, the first prototype, the propellers turned in, the top blades turned inward as it rotated. And they had buffet on the tail, a lot of buffet at low altitude, just flying around and pulling G's and what have you. A lot of buffet. So they determined that the twisted airflow coming off the propellers on this wing root was being separated and hitting the horizontal tail and causing a lot of this buffet that they didn't like. So they looked at it and said, I believe if we turn them the opposite direction, we'll get rid of some of that downwash turbulence back on the tail, but making this airfoil the angle of attack of the twisted slipstream from the propellers be in the opposite direction, and it'll kill some of this turbulence. So they did. The airplane ended up with, after the prototype, with outward going instead of inward going rotation. And it did. It pretty much killed it. The aerodynamics were right. It pretty much cleaned up the airflow on the tail. And let's see. Oh, I want to mention the lift coefficient on this is compared to a single engine airplane. In a simulated dogfight with your buddies, it seemed to me like you were always in a buffet. You just couldn't pull enough G's in the P-38 to satisfy yourself, unlike a single engine P-51 or P-39 or whatever. You could pull more G's. And I saw an NACA report that was done after the war where they compared different fighters on the G's that they could pull, correcting for the wing loading. In other words, if you made every airplane have the same wing loading, pounds per square foot, you would, of wing area, you would have equal wing loading. So they made those corrections and they went out and tested these. And sure enough, the P-38 would get a maximum lift coefficient of only about 1.2. Lift coefficient, I might mention, is just a ratio of what you could pull in, in the dynamic airstream that's capable of lift. So if it's 1.2, you're able to get 20% more than the weight of the airplane, essentially. So the P-38 could only pull about 1.2 Gs as compared to the single engine airplanes that could pull about 1.4 Gs. It confirmed my dislike for the P-38 buffeting and turns, and it just couldn't pull as much G's as I thought I could. And the reason I think for that is because in aerodynamics and calculating the lift coefficient of wings, you take the wing area and you include it through the nacelles. It's like these weren't there. It's like just a plain wing out in the airstream. But I think the P-38 as compared to a single engine that just has a single center nacelle fuselage, it only kills this much wing lift in this vicinity. Here you have three different things killing the lift. You have this and this and this. And I think that made the difference between the 1.2 G lift coefficient. I'll be 100 years old in 16 months, so excuse me. I can't say what I want to sometime. Anyway, 1.2 G's lift coefficient is compared to 1.4 lift coefficient for single engines. I think that's why you couldn't, but I might mention in the Pacific, they fought the Japanese with better turning airplanes at lower speeds. They wouldn't lose, they'd keep their speed up and just peck at them. Had to see them down there. This had good altitude with his turbos. They come down and they'd just take a shot and keep their speed up. And as soon as they started losing speed, they'd just peel off and pull up like at Mother Pass. That worked real well with the Japanese. But in the German and the Europe, it didn't work well. The Germans had airplanes that did essentially the same thing that we did. So you couldn't pull up and they'd pull up with you, and there was pretty even over there between the P-38 and the Messerschmitt, for instance. So you didn't have that advantage like you did in the Pacific. These didn't do as well in Europe as they did in the Pacific for that reason. And the other thing I was going to see, I was going to mention something else. Oh, these static weights that are on there just to even out the moment of the elevator. The mass of the elevator won't hang down when you're just sitting on the ground. You'd put this up forward, these mass, and that would balance it. So the elevator would just kind of be, wherever you put it, it'd stay there. It wouldn't. And the Army wanted that for some reason. Lockheed says, we don't need it, let them hang down. But the Army wanted that. So these mass balances were put on by Army requirements, and they were a hazard. People bailing out, a lot of times, either they'd go back or forward, but the parachute beginning, some of them pulled it too soon and it'd hang up on there. I was flying on one of my missions, I was flying with the leader. I was his wingman. He's actually an element leader, not the flight leader of the flight. But he started slowing down, and I said, "What's wrong?" Because I kept pulling the power back, and we were really, everybody was leaving us. We were going home after an escort mission near Luxembourg. Anyway, he says, my propellers are running away. That meant they were going in a flat pitch, not much forward to thrust, and just turning fast, both of them. And I said, I noticed, I said, smoke's coming out of your right engine, the nacelle. Then the other one started doing that. And then pretty soon there was flame coming out. He says, I'm getting out of this SOB. And the last I saw him, he was right here, and he was turning into me. I was right on the wing. And so I pulled up to be over him, make sure he didn't bail out. By the time I got over here, he was off. So I was right up close, and I was looking here for him, and not back here. And so I watched him go. We were about 5,000 feet above the ground. I watched him go down, and just before he hit, I thought I saw something behind the airplane. They went. Nobody saw a parachute. His parachute never came out, so we weren't sure what happened to him. And some of the people went down a liaison plane because that was occupied Germany by then in that area. The military weren't controlling it. So they took a liaison plane down there, talked to the civilians. The civilian says, yes, he was on there, attached to the airplane, and we buried him. We've already buried him. And so he somehow, I don't know if he pulled the chute or what happened, but somehow it tangled on this as he went by. And so he did go in because of those things. His name was Houston, and George Houston, I believe it was, a real Southern gentleman from Mississippi, a real Southern gentleman. He had the accent, and he was just a perfect gentleman all the time. I remembered him well. Well, I've talked a lot about this. I guess they're interested in finding out what happened to me when I got shot down, because I made it back. Here I am. I was shot down it was April the 10th, so it was real close to the solstice, and March the 21st is the solstice. Right after that, the sun set right close to 6 o'clock. So I was down on the ground about 5 o'clock. It's about an hour before sunset. We've been strafing these half tracks and trucks that were coming out of the, and the the situation was with me, I got hit in the left engine. I was about 500 feet on the third pass, getting ready for the third pass on these trucks. And I heard a thud, looked out, and there was little flames coming out of the seams of the nacelle coverings. You know, the Zeus fasteners had, these panels were stressed for structural strength when they were in place with these Zeus fasteners. And so they were in the cracks in the cells. There was smoke and a little bit of flame coming out immediately. So I thought, I'll pull out the mixture and cut off the back and cut off the flow of the fuel to that engine and see if it'll fire will go up. I'll feather up. So I pulled on the left engine, I pulled the throttle back to out of cutoff and took it out, cut the engine off. And just as I did that, this flame just a ball of fire coming out over the, and so I popped the canopy right here. This, if I can point it out, it's not very big. I don't have anything here to point. I thought I had a pencil. It's this little square right here that you pop. This part doesn't come off. This is a solid bow back in here, or back in here rather. And this part, this part, both of them come off. Is a one-piece section here that comes off, and this is very narrow, probably 20 inches wide. Just about the width of my backpack and parachute. In fact, is a little bit wider. So I popped this, and immediately the smoke filled the cockpit. I mean, black smoke from the fuel. Black smoke is unoxidized soot in the smoke, and so that's what was happening. This fuel was burning and being sucked up somehow through the wing root into the cockpit. When I popped that, well, then the low pressure in the cockpit of this flow of the air over here sucked that smoke in the cockpit. I could not see a thing. It's like an ink barrel. And the side windows right here are ratchet. You roll them up, those side panels, with a little crank. But to lower them, there's a little latch there that unlatches the ratchet, and you can shove these windows down to crawl out on the wing. And so I could not, in that smoke, in the panic to get out of the airplane with this ball of flame over here, I could not find that little latch to shut the window down. So I got to get out of here, but this thing is really about to explode. And so you can see the fuel is in, most of it was in the wing root. This had already been burned out, of course, out here and the wing root was very close over here to this fire. So I was in a panic to get out of there, and I just couldn't find that latch. So I'd already popped this canopy panel, and there's a bowl right here that in the back of the canopy, right back the edge of the seat behind me, the armor. And so when I tried to get out, in the panic, I had not disconnected my microphone and my oxygen mask and all these things. And so I just took my helmet off and I'm not going to fight it. I threw it in the cockpit, and I started forcing my way out with this backpack and this narrow thing, trying to get out. We got about this far. I was still going pretty fast on that approach for the strafing. At that time, even though I'd cut the power off, we were still going fast. And so the wind stream pinned me to this bow and with my backpack. And I thought, gee, I couldn't move with that wind stream. But I kept kicking at the instrument panel with my feet. And all of a sudden, I was clear of the airplane. Never saw it again, actually. And I found myself, I don't know if I went over the tail or under it. But at that speed I was going in, and the incidents of the airplane, I believe when I stood up that I actually, at that high speed, I probably went over it. Instead of at low speed, I would have slipped off and gone under it. But that high speed, I believe, saved my life, maybe kept me from getting hung up or hitting the tail. Anyway, I made it out, and I pulled the parachute rip cord. I was landing on my back, head down, and I pulled the rip cord out this far, and nothing happened. Nothing. Well, this is it. But I went and stretched it as far as I could. All of a sudden, the pilot chute spilled out, and the parachute came up between my legs, and it opened and jerked me around, and I probably was about 200 feet by then when the parachute opened, and I looked down at the edge of the village, and the Germans were starting to come out of the village. I was just about at the edge of the village, just short of the edge of the village where I was going to land. And this German village was packed with, I could see just lots of military uniforms and stuff there. The village was packed with German people, German military, and they were at the edge of the village. They were already starting to come out with the guns on me. And so I went ahead and touched down probably 100 yards or so short of the village with the Germans about that far from me. And I had my 45 in a shoulder holster right here. So I knew that I didn't want to touch that. So I held up my hand while I was in the air. And so when I got out, I landed very gently. I only weighed 117 pounds then. And so I landed very gently, and the Germans came up, got my gun, took my watch, and so forth. And I was marched into the village with a cadre of Germans around me, and through the village, and somebody had already taken the parachute by then into the village, and the women were looking at it. As I walked by, they were looking at the parachute, and I thought that was kind of ironic. But they milled around for a while, and after a few minutes, they decided to send me down to, apparently, to the people I'd been strafing, about 3/4 of a mile away, this column. And they only sent one German soldier with me to take me down there. Nobody else wanted to, or they thought it wasn't necessary. But this German soldier walked behind me, and I couldn't speak to him. He couldn't me, but he held his gun out of the holster on me all the time. And I got about halfway down there, and I said, I stopped. I was afraid, what I was afraid of, that they sent this one guy to execute me away from the village, and have just one person that was witness, not a bunch, so they could cover it over, later. So I stopped and I motioned to him, put that in the holster, put it in the holster. Finally, he did. After a little bit, he put it in, and we continued walking down to the column that we had been strafing, and there was quite a few burned out vehicles, still smoking when I walked past, and they took me to the officer in charge of that column. He's a first lieutenant, had the meanest face you ever saw. And I thought, this is it. I saw him. It looked like he's from Hollywood, the villain. And I, he said, he introduced himself. He spoke better English than I did, being I was from West Texas. So he spoke better English. And he says to me, he says, Lieutenant, you're the bravest man I ever saw. I was on the third pass, and I got shot down. Supposed to make one pass. So he said, you're the bravest man I ever saw. And I thought, the dumbest you ever saw. And anyway, he was nearly cordial to me. So they milled around a little while, and they, on one of the half tracks that he signed me to be in, they left. It was dark by then, and I might mention on this third mission, before we went strafing, we left. We were at our first base in Germany at that time that we had left for this mission, and it was on the west side of the Rhine River, just south of Bonn, Germany. That was their capital for a while after World War II. So it was about, as I recall, about 20 miles south on the west side of the river where our base was, and we had taken off that afternoon about 4 o'clock. As I said, as the third mission, they said, leave your parachutes in the plane, you're going on this other mission. And it turned out to be this strafing mission. So I left the parachute in, but I decided it was such a warm afternoon, I'd leave my jacket in the operations. Big mistake. I was shot down in my shirt sleeve, a GIOD wool shirt and pants, and a clodhopper's high top shoes I was flying in. And so I was cold for about a week for various reasons without a jacket. Anyway, he took us into the village from this column. We spent the night there, and they took my shoes off. Just he was apologetic. He says, Lieutenant, I have to take your shoes off, make sure that you don't leave. So they kept my shoes, and we spent the night there. The next morning, we cranked up the diesel engine on this half track, and several people in the column, his buddies that he commanded, and then we left, and we left about an hour or so before sunrise in the dark, and they made me sit on the floor in the half track with the side panels on the edges of this bed that's in the back of the half track. I was sitting on the floor, and I could not see out anything except the trees around. And at that time in Germany, that particular week, it was overcast nearly all the time, sometimes misting rain a little bit, kind of cool for April. And that's the reason I say I was cold throughout this week I spent with them. And the first morning, about 10 o'clock, they stopped the column, and we went, our particular group of Germans went into a farmhouse and spent most of the day in the farmhouse. And I don't know where they parked the half tracks. They left and went somewhere. But so when night came, well, they brought the half tracks back, and we loaded up again. Me sitting on the floor the second night, and we went into this forest, probably 5 or 10 miles. I don't know. They didn't go very fast, and we probably were. I didn't have a watch, but I probably about 3 hours. We went into the forest and spent the night in a building, several buildings there. Looked like a schoolhouse to me, sort of. It's very lighted inside. And so in this room they set us down in, my lieutenant that was in charge of me says, I've got a meeting here with my commander. And he went in the other room and left me there. During that meeting, there was a lot of heated conversation, and I thought they were talking maybe about me and getting rid of me. I didn't know, and I thought, if I have a chance, I'd better get out of here. So, sure enough, about after that meeting, came back and they put me in a wicker chair. A lot of German soldiers laying on the floor, and the door out was closed, and a German soldier right in front of it laying on the floor with his feet within inches of the door. Well, at about 4 o'clock, I would estimate, I just happened to wake up, looked around, everybody was asleep, everybody. I could hear the German sentry snoring out in the dark hall past this door. And I looked at that German soldier on them. He'd moved just a little bit, and his foot was about 6 inches from the door. And I thought, I believe, 117 pounds, I can get by that. I believe without touching him, holding that door. So I tried it. I was able to inch out without touching his feet, without door, and by holding it real close. And so after I was out of that, I just out in this dark hall where this sentry was snoring. I went through a couple of glass double doors out to the open and started running. That's why I escaped from the first group of Germans. I spent the day walking. About noon, I ran into a very close to encounter with more Germans. And I remember I was in ODs, no coat, just OD shirt and pants, and these clodhopper shoes, high top GI shoes I'd been flying in. And I had no insignia. We didn't fly with any insignia on us. We were completely bare. Anyway, along a ridge, I just kind of came over a ridge, and here was just on the other side of the ridge was a whole, probably 100 Germans, soldiers, all laying on the ground. It was around noon, and some of them were eating, and they were laughing and cutting up, and they saw me about the same time I saw them. I was probably about 100 yards, 50 to 100 yards away from them, this group. And there's probably 50 of them. I don't remember. It's a good size bivouac. So I just kept going. I didn't try to veer away from them, hide or anything. I just kept walking in a straight line along the bridge, and I didn't even look down at them. I didn't even, like they weren't there. I just kept walking. I could hear they had been laughing and cutting up, and all of a sudden it was dead silence. I just kept walking, and pretty soon they started talking again. this old guy, they looked at, this little old guy, he's probably some nitwit that couldn't be in the army, and just some farmhand or something. They let me go. They didn't say a word, and luckily, 'cause I didn't know German anyway. They let me go, and I just kept going. I spent the afternoon. I was heading south because I could hear artillery way in the distance in this southerly direction, and uh, that's the direction I was going. Try to get back to the lines. So I spent the afternoon on a ridge because there's a 2-lane paved highway down about a half a mile, quarter to half a mile from the top of this, and there's a lot of bushes in it. I hope I'm not keeping you too long on this. They said they wanted the details, so I'm trying to give you the details. Uh, I spent the afternoon in these bushes looking at these columns of marching Germans, tanks and what have you going along, and there was a lull developed as maybe a mile or so where Germans, nobody was coming. And I was about 200 or 300 yards up in the bushes, and there's a truck, a big flatbed truck, no cab, just a seat, and an open thing behind. They probably used it to carry tanks or something on. So anyway, it was parked in the weeds there, and I thought, well, I'll go down and get under that and hide and see if I can't get across, keep going south. And that was towards the end of the evening. So I went down there and got under incidentally, I looked in the cab and there was a raincoat, a German military raincoat on the seat. But the weeds around the truck showed it hadn't been moved for a while. And so I took that and put it on and got under the truck, and just happened there's a spare tire wheel base thing made out of straps of iron riveted together, but they could slip a wheel in. But it was empty, and it was big enough for me to, wasn't very big, and so I was able to curl up in that uh, and watch this column of soldiers that I've seen in the distance marching by, and the tank tracks, their tracks that go around the drive wheels and the bogies. Anyway, I could see as a tank went by, these tire tanks that shaking the truck, and I could see them and the the feet of the German soldiers. I was right up under the bed in the spare tire looking down. They really couldn't see me marching towards it because I was up under there. And so I was hidden there and I watched them till dark. And incidentally, the German soldiers that I saw, uh, quite a few of them were wearing GI combat boots that they'd taken off of our GIs during the operations, dead GIs. There was these high top uh, shoes that had a cuff sewed on the top of the shoe, about so wide, with a couple of buckle straps that you could put your pants down in there to keep them out of the mud, and have these cuffs tightened up around the bottom of your trousers. So that's the way the GI boots were made for us, unlike their jack boots or regular boots that you pull up. Anyway, a lot of the German soldiers were wearing those in this column. And the columns kept coming up until after dark. And I was wanting to get across the river that was right by this highway, probably 20 or 30 feet wide, the small river. And there's a bridge across it. in the southerly direction. Well, these Germans, some of them had peeled off and stayed at the bridge. And it was getting probably around 8 or 9 o'clock. It looked like they were never going to leave. And I thought, well, I'm wearing this German raincoat over these GI things. I believe I can just walk by them too in the dark and continue on, because I was afraid they'd be there all night, and the next morning it got light, I wouldn't be able to escape again. So I went ahead and took that chance, and I walked about halfway across the bridge, and sure enough, they were on the other edge of the bridge, and I was on this side going across the river. The bridge was only probably maybe 30 feet wide, so they weren't too far from me, but I'd walked on this other edge across the bridge, got about halfway, and they stopped talking also. And I could tell they were looking at me and who's this guy, what's going on? But I kept walking like I knew they were there, didn't bother me, and I made it across, and so twice I was running into Germans, and I got by with it, and so I spent the night up in the hills, past them, and during the night there was a big roar. It may have been maybe a dream or something, nightmare that I was having, but I wasn't sure. I woke up at the start with this big roar, and I didn't know what it was, so I moved out of the forest into a plowed field, and I rolled up in the raincoat. This plowed field was moist, not muddy, but moist, and I spent the night rolled up in that German raincoat in that field. And early in the morning, before dawn, I could hear dogs barking way in the distance, probably at farmhouses or something. So I moved back in the forest and continued during the day. And I might mention, let's see, there's no ladies in here, I don't think. Uh, I'll say it's kind of crude. I ran into two Germans, again about noon, in this forest. I was going one way and two of them coming my way. All of a sudden we saw each other through the trees, probably 50, 100 feet apart from me. And they saw me about the same time I saw them. We were nearly coming head on to each other. So I just moved off to the side a little bit, turned my back to them, unzipped my fly, and started to take a leak. And I didn't pay attention to them, and they just kind of veered off a little bit, went by me 10 or 15 feet away while I was taking a leak. And so it worked. That was 3 times that uh, the I went on that afternoon, and I came probably the same river was probably around, but maybe several miles away from that bridge I went on that night. I came to another bridge going across the river about the same size. I'd been heading south, and I looked at there's a bridge across it, nobody around it, nobody. And so I looked in the forest, I couldn't see anything. And so I sat there until about 8 o'clock at night and decided to go across. I could see that they had mined it. There was explosives hanging all over it, and they were ready to blow it up. So I thought, well, there's just doesn't look like anybody there, and it's dark. I think I'll just walk across it. I got about halfway across it, and I heard this halt. I kept walking. Remember, I was wearing this GI German raincoat over mine. I just kept walking, thinking maybe I'd get away with it. But the second time he said halt, he put a shell in his Mauser rifle. Clunk, clunk, clunk. I recognized exactly what he was doing, and so I, I just held up my hand and turned around, and I started shucking off that German raincoat. I didn't want to be caught in a German uniform and be shot as a spy. I shucked that off and just let it fall on the bridge. And this one lone German with a rifle came up to me. He, we couldn't converse, and I said I had a cold by then. I'd come actually it was hard for me to talk, and I croaked and talk. And so he picked up the German raincoat. I thought he's using that as evidence, and he marched me on into the woods 100 or so yards away. There's a little shack in there that I just didn't see when I was watching for thought. And there was several German officers in there, and they one of the officers had he didn't have his cap on, but he had the jagged SS on his collars. I thought, this is it. These guys aren't going to fool around. And so he started questioning me, and I said, I'm American, shot down. Uh, at first, I kind of croaked and said, I can't understand you. I can't talk. He slapped me, and he says, answer my questions. And he spoke English. And uh, I said, I'm American soldier, airman, and I shot down. And I had at that, I failed to mention, I had a rag around my throat that was made out of a parachute. Just our parachute people had torn up an old chute, and they gave me a strip used as a muffler, and used it to keep the German on the chaffing of that wool collar, and also the shoulder holes. It protects your neck, and so I had that around my neck, and I said, I was shot down, and here's a piece of the parachute. And he he agreed that, I mean, that that made sense, that I was an American shot down. So he says, we're leaving here and we're taking you with us. They had a little car that wasn't much bigger than a Volkswagen, and it was a little sedan. And there's about 5 of them and me in that little car. And me being the smallest one in the group, uh, made me sit on one of their laps in this car. I was sitting on the German officer's lap in his car. They took me into the woods, to a place I don't know where, probably just a few miles away, and the they put me in charge of a sergeant. They said, this sergeant will be with you. So they put us in a room. The sergeant, he also spoke pretty good English. And so the sergeant, in our conversations during the day, one of the things he said to me, he says, why are you over here when we're trying to save the world from Bolshevism? They call the communists Bolsheviks. When we're trying to save the world from Bolshevism, and I kind of lamely, I said, well, you have some problems too. I didn't want to argue with him. Uh, I would lose the argument. I knew that, and so I didn't, wasn't aggressive on my answer. I just said, well, you have some problems too. We're over here for that, and So they kept me with that sergeant for about 2 days exactly. And the second day in the afternoon, they said, we're surrendering. Now, this was in the Ruhr pocket. It's about 200 miles wide in every direction in April of 1945. The Russians coming in from the east, Patton from the south, Montgomery from the west, northwest, through Belgium, through the Netherlands. And so they were in this Ruhr pocket. Lots of German military had been hemmed in there. Says, we're surrendering this area. We're turning you back over to the Americans. So sure enough, they took me to a hospital that afternoon, and a German hospital that was an eye. Only thing they treated in that hospital were eye injuries. And there was one American GI in there, enlisted man, that had been shot by a sniper on a hillside, and the bullet had come in and taken out, I think, his right eye. He was one-eyed. He had a patch over. And he and me were the only two Americans in there. And so the Germans wanted to surrender, and they thought this would be a good ploy to show how well they treated American prisoners. And they gave me something from my bad cold, and sure enough, probably about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a first lieutenant and a couple of enlisted men came to the hospital, and the German major that was in there, kind of a uh, kind of a puffed up guy, wanted to show his military rank and position and so forth. He took his sword, and handed it to this American GI, a first lieutenant with the GIs. And he, this GI, the first lieutenant, took it and said, okay. So he took the soldier and the sword from this German officer, and the German officers took all of us. Says, I'll give you a tour of the hospital. So he took us around, showing them what they did. And then after that, the American first lieutenant says, well, we got to leave. And so the guy with the bad eye and me trailing behind him trailed out with this first lieutenant. He still had this sword, and he'd been kind of twirling around, and it didn't impress him at all. And so he's about to get in the Jeep and to leave with us, and the German officer says, Lieutenant, could I have my sword back? And the lieutenant, sure, he handed it back. I thought that was typical American. Typical American. He wasn't impressed at all with it. And so anyway, we went down to the mile or so away where there's lots of German soldiers laying on sitting around and laying around on the ground, and the GIs were eating a night meal. And that's the first meal I'd had for 5 days. I was with the Germans. They offered me some meals the very first morning at that farmhouse, but it smelled so bad I didn't want it. And I just wasn't in the mood for eating. So they offered me food that time, no more after that, while in captivity. And of course, I was escaped for a day and a half. And so I had no food for the 5 days. And when I got this GI food that night, it was good. The infantry ate a lot better than we in the Air Force did at that time. They deserved it. And they had all this good food, but my stomach was slow or something. I couldn't eat much of it. And I handed the thing over to one of the Germans, laying sitting there on the ground. One of the prisoners says, "You want this?" And oh yeah. So he ate it, my first meal. And the next morning, I can't remember where I spent the night that night, where I slept. I think it was in a building on a couch, but I'm just not sure. My memory slipped there. Anyway, the next morning I got up. I said, "Have you got a coat?" You know, I was without a coat. Anybody got a coat that they can let me have? They said, every military coat was taken. I mean, there wasn't anybody that had a extra coat laying around. But there was a German rain overcoat on a hanger. They said, "Here, wear this." So uh, I have to back up a little bit. I left out something that pertinent here. The afternoon after I had eaten and given the German soldier this food, there's a truck sitting there that the Germans had all piled in their weapons, their rifles, their sidearms, and everything. I said to the lieutenant in charge of this group, I said, "Lieutenant, can I get up there and take some of these back to my squadron?" He said, "Sure." So I hopped up on the truck, and I picked up 2 Lugers, 2 P-38s, 2 Italian Berettas, and a Polish radome, and probably a baby Browning, little 25. I had all those guns on me, and I had them everywhere. So when they gave me this raincoat, I I could have them and had the raincoat over me. So that morning, after I woke up, uh, I said, "I want to get back to my squadron. They're supposed to go to Castle from Albuquerque to Castle. They were scheduled to." I said, "I need transportation to go to Castle." So the lieutenant milled around and says, "We got a mail truck going down to about 30 miles south to a city been wiped out with bombs." Anyway, they sent me down there on this truck, and the lieutenant, before he put me on there, when I went in to ask him for transportation, I had this German overcoat over me, and I said, "I'm American, you know, blah blah blah, and I need transportation to Castle." And I just, it was kind of warm in the room, and I opened my coat. I had all these guns. He, the German, at that time, he didn't know who I was before I started telling him. I opened up my coat in that warm room, and he says, "Get this crowd out of here. He's got guns all over him." I had this civilian coat on. And so, anyway, after we straightened that out, he sent us out about 30 miles south, and they had a half track going across from that town to Castle, about 100, something over 100 miles away. They put me in that half track with 3 GIs, a sergeant and an old grizzly sergeant, probably 40 years old. In those days, that was old for us. Anyway, he was in charge of us, and we spent the night after going quite a ways down this dirt road to Castle. We needed a place to stay. And so he says, "Stop this farmhouse." So he went in the farmhouse and he kicked the Germans out. Says, "We're spending the night in your house. Go find someplace else to be." So we spent the night in that house. We didn't touch a thing except their beds, and they had a cellar with wine in it. We had we opened 2 bottles of wine. One was a Moselle clear wine, white wine, and a cherry wine, cherry made out of cherries. That's the best wine I ever tasted. We didn't touch a thing. We left the house just like it was with a ruffle bed that we spent. And they had a feather bed in there that I spent the night on, which beat everything I'd been on. And I thought, I have to have a feather bed someday. I do have. Uh, anyway, we spent the night there, went to Castle the next day, and sure enough, when I got out the airfield there, the German airfield where we were supposed to go to, there's only 2 Americans there that had been set up to do uh, reconnoitering on, the sewers and uh, any kind of barracks or anything that we could make use of when the squadron or the group came in. But they said that this move has been canceled and we are leaving. And uh, they said we're still at Albuquerque, but we're moving in farther into Germany. Well, anyway, I flew back with them on a UC-78, Cessna 78, and they brought in, and they give me some sulfa. The flight uh, flight surgeon gave me some shots of sulfa, and that killed that cold just dead right away. And while I was there, they said, you can't stay with the squadron. You have to go to Paris to be interviewed, to go through interrogation because you've been down 5 days behind enemy lines. And prisoners of war have to be interrogated. So they sent me to Paris. They made me take all my stuff, barracks bag and B4, with me. And so I was essentially kicked out of the squadron. And I went to Paris, spent 2 or 3 days there, uh, had a room with 2 other American officers that had been POWs at the Ritz Hotel, which is just off Champs-Élysées. And I went through the prisoner of war thing the next day, and they asked me, how I was treated and blah, blah. And I said I was treated very well, and I have no complaints against the Germans. And but at the end of the line, there's something that happened that made me be a non-believer of our American Red Cross. I'd not seen an American Red Cross or a donut or anything all the time I was in the military. You heard all these stories about all this stuff they're giving the GIs and stuff. Never had I run across a Red Cross. Well, at the end of this line, there's a couple of Red Cross people there giving out 2 packs of cigarettes and 2 candy bars. And they made you sign a sheet saying you will pay for these for your next paycheck when you get it. So pay the Red Cross for these. And I thought, no more donations to the Red Cross. And I've kept that promise from then on. I got in trouble at Sandia on that. Anyway, they the prisoner of war line, one of the things when they ask you about treatment and so forth, if you've been down 5 days behind the lines, the Geneva Convention of those days said that anybody down at least 5 days can be shot if they're caught again, or the Germans on our side or us on their side. If they catch you the second time and they have a notice that you've been down in their line, they can shoot you as a spy. That may seem strange, but that was in the Geneva Convention in those days. And so they made me sign a sheet before they let me go back to the squadron that I knew this information and I was willing to live by it. So I did sign that waiver, and I got flying back to my squadron. At that time, they'd moved into a village in central Germany, farther in from Kassel, named Langensalza. That was our last base in Germany. Langensalza was a sod field, Luftwaffe sod field, and it was full of Ju-88 night fighters, the latest models that had the inline engine with a circular round radiator in front. Made you think that might be a radial engine behind them, but they were inline engines, very powerful, and that plane was very close to capability of 400 miles an hour, that last Ju-88. Well, the field was filled with those, so I got to fly. I sat on the ground 2 or 3 days, and the missions were going out, and I went to the flight officer, the flight captain that was in charge of the operations, the operations officer, and I said, Joe, why am I sitting on the ground? Well, I came back to fly. He says, well, what you've been through, didn't think you wanted to go on a combat missions. I said, that's why I'm here. So I got 3 more missions, but at that stage, it was right before the end of the war, which was May the 8th, by the way. I flew my last combat mission on May the 8th. I was shot down on the 27th mission, got 3 more, so I got a total of 30 missions before the war ended. And the last 3 missions were just routine patrols looking for escaping German planes coming back from the Eastern Front. And there's only spotted one, and one of the flight leaders flew down in front of him and gave him a burst out in front where he could see the tracers going by, and he pointed down. That plane went right down and landed. It was a civilian, probably equivalent of one of our Bonanzas or something. I don't think I ever saw it up close. I don't know what it was, but it's just a little. Anyway, those 3 missions, I made my total of 30 missions during the war. I don't have a lot of time in P-38s. I got 30 hours back in Chico when we transferred from E-63s to P-38s. Then in the combat, I averaged probably close to 3 hours a mission, 30 missions. So I had, I think, 85 combat hours. That's all in the P-38. And then I went out on missions where I'd stick around operations on the days that I wasn't flying missions, and I'd be there and they'd say, you want to go up and check out this airplane we've been working on. And so I flew several of those missions during that time. I think I had a total of only about 135 hours in P-38s as compared to after the war in the Air National Guard here. On the F-80 T-33, I got 800 hours in that fighter in 5 years from 53 to 58. 1958, we switched to F-100s. The world's first supersonic fighter was American, the F-100, and I got to fly. So I got to fly it about 500 hours before I left the Guard in 1962. I might mention that also I got 30 hours in the Air Guard in P-51s, which I wanted to fly all the time, but I didn't get to during the war. But they'd just gotten back from Korea, the Air Guard. They still had P-51s before we switched to F-80s. So I got to fly 30 hours in the P-51, which I always wanted to. My favorite airplane. Great for buzzing cumulus clouds. Great, great, great. And we went to Casper, Wyoming every summer in their Air Guard for several years. And so that summer, I checked out in the 51 just before we left, got about 10 hours in it, route racing and what have you, formation. And I got 20 more hours up at Casper out on the gunnery range, flying air-to-air gunnery. I did pretty well from my escape from non-flying for several years and got checked out in the 51. And right away, I was able to fire expert air gunnery on the 51. So anyway, that's my story on fighters. I joined the Army Air Corps on essentially my 18th birthday when they'd lowered the requirements right after the war. About on March the 29th was my 18th birthday. I was finishing up my engineering first year in college, and they sent recruiters around, give you the physical and the written exam. I took that and passed, of course, and I waited until November, about 8 or 9 months later after that, before they finally called me up to go to flying school. And I flew Ryan Ryan PT-22s in primary at King City, California. That's about 30 miles south of Salinas, not far from Monterey, Salinas, down the Salinas Valley, south of. And I got 65 hours in the P-22. Went over the Kettleman Hills there to Lemoore, which is not the same base that the Navy uses now at Lemoore. They had a different base there for basic flying, and got 70 hours in the BT-13s. Loop field, 70 hours in the AT-6. As I said a while ago, I graduated October the 1st in 43I before I went down to Randolph from there and went through the instructor school at Randolph Field in San Antonio before I went back to the same squadron at Lemoore that a few months before I had been a cadet. I went back as a flight instructor in the same squadron I was in. So I was really low man on the totem pole. I said sir to everybody as a second lieutenant. Anyway, I was flight instructor for a few months until about April 1st, as I said, when they closed the base. So that's my story on my career as a military pilot. And I want to thank everybody for putting up with me. And I'm sorry that I gave you such a disjointed things I had to back up on when I missed, I should have said. So any questions you have, I might mention the airplane I was shot down in was the latest model, P-38, that just got in the squadron and it only had about 5 military hours on it, and it was assigned to my flight leader. But they assigned me, I was they thought I flew pretty well, so they assigned me his airplane on this particular mission. This airplane, you never read about it, but this LOL-5 model had a radar altimeter in it and a radar tail warning. When anybody went by you on the tail and your headset, dong, dong, dong. Pilots didn't like that because we were always switching sides, making combat turns on formation. And every time we did that, God, somebody about to shoot me down. So anyway, they didn't like that. And the radar altimeter was mounted down here, right on the side of you. And you could look down in that. You're flying over terrain, hills and stuff. That radar was just doing like this, and it didn't do you any good either. But that last model was that. And my flight leader's name was Captain Edmonds. And Captain Edmonds didn't like me at all. I took his airplane out, his brand new airplane, and got it shot down. When I got back to the squadron, he didn't care whether I was there or not, but he sure missed his airplane. So anyway, that's a little side story.
Did you fly with the Air Guard here? Did you fly with the Air Guard here?
I flew in the Air Guard here from 52 to 9 years, from 53 to 62.
Clay Keene was also a P-38 pilot.
Right.
He got shot down, but he walked with a whole bunch of, I guess, peasants or something, walked right back over in the American lines. The story used to
I don't remember that story of Clay. I knew Clay is one of my best friends, and he was 94 years old when he died, buried out at Fairfield Cemetery.
So what was your military grade when World War II ended?
Second lieutenant all the time. I was the world's only second lieutenant in all the military. Only permanent second lieutenant. Everybody else got promoted. Oh.
Did you ever load the plane with HVAR rockets?
No. We, on our particular squadron, I think maybe a few of the planes might have had racks out there for the rockets, but I'm not sure anybody in our squadron, but maybe in the group, but they didn't use rockets very much on any of the missions. And the only bomb missions that I did, I might, if you don't want me to hang on for a little bit more, and when I was dive bombing, if you look at the placement of where the bombs are, these are fuel tanks, but they're right back of the propeller arc, just on the edge of it. And you weren't supposed to dive more than about 40 degrees to make sure that any bombs wouldn't hit the propeller arc. Well, being a maverick, I decided that I believe when the shackles open, you feel it, you can kind of feel it. When you press the button, the bomb release button, that I could escape, pull the plane immediately after that, jerk it, and clear the arcs. So at Chico, in that 30 hours, we did some dive bombing and some aerial gunnery. And I was able to, with practice bombs, I didn't say anything to anybody. And they just had GIs out at the bomb field marking, the hits and misses. So nobody paid too much attention to how you were flying, and they're just looking for the hit. So I decided to try it, and I wanted to see if I could vertically dive bomb. And if you look at the incidence angle the wing is mounted and the camber, to fly perpendicular vertically, as I kept trying it, you're actually on your back about 10 degrees or so, about like this, see, on the back. And your gun sight doesn't do you any good dive bombing vertically. You're looking out of the top of the canopy straight down, and it's all Kentucky windage. So, but you're vertical and you don't have all the dispersion. And so I decided to try it, and I got by with it. I was able to feel that, and so I made several dive bombing runs at Chico out of near south actually of Chico in the dive bombing range, and I was able to have those practice bombs not to hit the propeller. So in combat over in Europe, I used the same technique on 2 missions. One was to Holly Air Base, that's southwest of Berlin, about 100 or so miles, 150 or so, and also on a and kind of in central Germany, late in the war, on a roadblock that the infantry called and see if we could knock out for them when we were just out on looking for targets and we had bombs on it. So I used them twice, once to hit a great big building, probably a hangar or something at Holly, and it put the bomb right in the center of that building, and that the roadblock, everybody had missed it during the conventional bombing, missed that roadblock. And the infantry had sent an artillery shell with red smoke to it, so we knew where it was. So on this roadblock, I got vertical, and the guy says, retail was our call sign for the squadron. Retail, you hit it dead center. I was the last man in because I made a couple of passes and get about here, and they'd say, here come another guy, and I have to pull up and try it again. So I was the last man, and I hit that roadblock. And as I said, the Holly hangar, I was able to hit that thing dead center. And the technique I used, the ground fire in Europe at that time, the small caliber stuff would reach up to about 5,000 feet. The 88s would fire down in that region, but they weren't very accurate because they couldn't track fast enough. So between 5,000 and 10,000 feet, there's less chance of being hit. So I'd get up to 10,000 feet and I'd pull back the power about 110 miles an hour. And as the target went by my leading edge right here, I'd peel over and get on my back, and I use that technique. I might mention with those regulators that held the pressure on the turbos supposed to be even. Back in near idle, they didn't work, and you'd have surging, and you were sitting on the rudder, looking up through the top of the canopy like this. So it wasn't all peaches and cream on making those, but I was able to roll in at 10,000 feet and be able to pull out for 5,000 feet. Give me time to get lined up on the target and make a hard pull out. And so I used that technique twice in Europe. It worked both times. Nobody ever asked me about vertical releases. I don't know if to this day if anybody knew what I was doing, but I did make those hits. So I thought that might be a little interesting to you, along with the characteristics of the airplane. Guess that's all.
Sir, we'd like to thank you when we
Well, I kept it. And I might mention, I've lost about 3 inches of height. I never was big. I was 5'6". I think now I've shrunk to about 5'3". I'm not sure, but all of you guys look like trees to me now.
We got something for you, Jim. Maybe
Oh,
you recognize it.
oh,
Hopefully.
wow, beautiful, beautiful. Great, thank
Early
you.
Christmas present.
Oh, I like that.
Made it look like they're spinning, you know?
That's That's really great. Thank you.
You're
Who
welcome.
did this?
I made it.
You made it. Oh,
It has your some of your information. Bottom.
oh,
I
that
was
was
giving it to
terrific.
you.
Yeah,
Picture.
that was taken when I was 20 years old at Chico. While I was soon after we got P-38.
Uh-huh.
We had a guy with a 35 millimeter camera take pictures of me, one of my friends. That, and I was also had some with me out in the wing. But that was it. Yeah.
That's yours, sir.
Well, thank you.
Joy.
Oh boy, that's worth it. Wow. I noticed I've lost one of the air intakes, carburetor air intake. I've noticed they're on this. It's, no, it's the other model. These are still
We
on,
got one more.
but I lost it on one of the models I had. But there, see this. Incidentally, those, if a few of you don't know about P-38s, something I missed on it. The engine air coolers, the glycol coolers, are back here. They're not in the nose. As I said, that's intercooler and oil cooler. The engine coolant fluid is in these radiators, and if you took cowlings off of the P-38, it looks like it's just solid ducts. You know, hot air ducts in your house. Why, it's just packed with ducts, stuff going back and forth. Fluid from these, piece of the compressed air from the supercharger going in through the thing and then back to the carburetor. So it's there wasn't if you poured a bottle of mercury in there on the top of one of those things, it'd never get to the ground. It is so packed. Okay, that is worth a beautiful model. About the right thickness for the airfoil.
Yeah.
Yeah, they did a good job on these. Boy, it's beautiful. Look at that canopy.
Was your, when your plane was hit and you had to open the canopy to bail out, was it flying level like that or was it?
Yeah, I was flying level. I was getting ready. I was about 2 or 3 miles out from the target. I was down to 500 feet, moving pretty fast, and getting ready to zero in. When I got hit, I guess I forgot to mention while I was in that with that first lieutenant that first night after they marched me down there. About 30 minutes after I got there, a German soldier came up and joined the group, and the lieutenant says, "This is a man that shot you down." And I turned to him and shook hands with him and congratulated him. And he didn't speak English, and I didn't. And I asked the lieutenant, I says, "What kind of gun did he hit me with?" And I think he said a 37 millimeter. I think that's it. And he says, this man says he got you with his last round. I didn't know where to leave him or not, but that's the story. Got me with his last round.
Thank you again, sir. We appreciate it.